May 23rd, 1944, southeastern England. German reconnaissance pilot Oberleutnant Klaus Hahn banked his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 over the Kent countryside, his camera whirring as it captured images of what appeared to be the largest military build-up in human history. Below him, spread across dozens of airfields and marshalling yards, sat hundreds of Sherman tanks, countless artillery pieces, rows of landing craft in estuaries, and what looked like an entire American army preparing for invasion. Hahn's hands trembled slightly as he advanced the film, knowing these photographs would be crucial intelligence for the Reich. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have imagined, was that he was photographing one of history's greatest illusions. Nearly everything below him was fake. The tanks were inflatable rubber. The artillery pieces were painted canvas stretched over wooden frames. The landing craft were plywood shells. The entire army was a phantom, and Klaus Hahn was doing exactly what British intelligence wanted him to do. He was being deceived. This is the story of how Britain's most secret units, armed with nothing more than paint, canvas and audacity, convinced the German High Command that invasion would come at Calais instead of Normandy. How they created entire armies from thin air, made divisions appear and disappear across continents, and fooled some of the most experienced military intelligence officers in the world into making catastrophic strategic errors. And how inflatable tanks and wooden guns held 15 German divisions away from the real invasion beaches, long enough for Allied forces to secure a foothold that would lead to Hitler's defeat. The story begins not with tanks or deception units, but with a middle-aged British filmmaker named Geoffrey Barkas, who in 1940 found himself with an unusual problem. Barkas had been commissioned as a major in the Royal Engineers and sent to North Africa where British forces were desperately trying to hold Egypt against Italian and German advances. The problem was simple and insurmountable. The Germans had more tanks, more aircraft, better positions, and superior intelligence. Every time British forces tried to concentrate for an attack, German reconnaissance spotted the build-up and responded accordingly. Barkas, whose expertise was in visual effects and cinematography, not warfare, proposed something that his superiors considered insane. What if we could make them see things that aren't there? What if we could hide entire divisions and make phantom armies appear where none exist? Most military officers laughed. The idea of using movie magic to fight a war seemed absurd, but one man didn't laugh. Lieutenant Colonel Dudley Clark, an intelligence officer who had been thinking along similar lines, saw the potential immediately. In December 1940, Clark established an advanced headquarters, a force, a deception unit with the specific mission of misleading Axis intelligence about British strength, positions and intentions in North Africa. The unit was so secret that most British officers didn't know it existed. Those who did know were forbidden from mentioning it under pain of court-martial. Clark recruited an extraordinary team. Alongside Barkas came stage designers from London's West End, commercial artists, sculptors, and even a professional magician named Jasper Maskelyne, who specialised in large-scale illusions. These men, most of whom had never fired a rifle in anger, would create deceptions that altered the course of entire campaigns. The first challenge was technical. How do you create a convincing fake tank that can fool aerial reconnaissance from 20,000 feet, but can also be moved quickly and doesn't require massive resources to build? The solution came from an unlikely source. After weeks of experimentation, they discovered that German reconnaissance cameras, shooting from high altitude, couldn't distinguish fine detail. What mattered was shape, shadow, and the overall impression of military hardware. A fake tank didn't need to look perfect, it just needed to look right from above. The design team created templates using actual tanks as models. They measured every dimension, studied how light fell across armoured surfaces at different times of day, and analysed hundreds of aerial reconnaissance photos to understand what German photo interpreters were looking for. Then they began building. The Mark I fake tank, developed in early 1941, was a masterpiece of efficient deception. The basic structure was wood, light battens assembled into a frame that approximated a tank's shape. Over this frame went painted canvas, carefully shaded to create the illusion of shadow and depth. The tracks were painted directly onto the ground, with actual vehicle tracks added for realism. From ground level, these fakes were obviously fraudulent, like stage props in a school play. From 5,000 metres, through a reconnaissance camera lens, They were indistinguishable from real armour. Each fake tank cost approximately £8 to construct and could be assembled by 4 men in under 4 hours. A real Crusader tank cost £15,000 and required months of factory production. The cost effectiveness was staggering. But a force discovered something even more valuable than the fakes themselves. The Germans were predictable in their intelligence gathering. Reconnaissance flights followed regular patterns. Photo interpreters had specific things they looked for when assessing enemy strength. And German commanders, like most military officers, saw what they expected to see. If fake tanks appeared in a logical position, consistent with British doctrine, German intelligence accepted them as real. This predictability could be weaponized. The first major test came in March 1941 during Operation Compass, the British offensive that drove Italian forces out of eastern Libya. General Archibald Wavell, commanding British forces in the Middle East, faced a critical problem. He needed to attack Italian positions at Machili with armour, but his tank strength had been depleted. He had perhaps 50 operational tanks. The Italians, if they knew his actual strength, would defend aggressively knowing they had numerical superiority. A force created a phantom armoured brigade. Over the course of 2 weeks, they positioned 120 fake tanks in assembly areas south of Benghazi, complete with fake supply dumps, painted canvas command tents, and dummy artillery. Real vehicles moved among the fakes, creating dust and track marks. Radio operators transmitted on frequencies known to be intercepted by Italian signals intelligence, discussing maintenance schedules, ammunition loads, and tactical movements. The deception worked perfectly. Italian reconnaissance reported a massive British armoured force preparing for a major offensive. Italian commanders, believing they faced overwhelming odds, evacuated Machili before the attack even began, abandoning positions that would have been nearly impossible to take by force. British forces occupied the town without firing a shot. The fake tanks had achieved what real ones might not have, but this success was small compared to what came next. In October 1941, General Bernard Montgomery, newly appointed to command the 8th Army, faced the most critical battle of the North African campaign. At El Alamein, British and Commonwealth forces were dug in 60 miles west of Alexandria, the last defensive position before the Suez Canal. If Rommel's Africa cause broke through, Egypt would fall and the entire Middle East would be at risk. Montgomery planned to attack on October 23rd, striking from the north with overwhelming force, but Rommel was expecting an attack. German intelligence was watching carefully. If the Germans detected Montgomery's build-up in the north, they would reinforce that sector and the attack would fail. A force, now commanded by Colonel Dudley Clark himself, was given an impossible task. Hide 1,000 tanks, 1,000 artillery pieces, and 150,000 men in the northern sector while convincing the Germans the attack would come from the south. They had 3 weeks. What a force created has been called the greatest deception operation in military history up to that point. The plan, named Operation Bertram, worked on multiple levels simultaneously. First, real tanks and artillery in the northern attack sector were disguised. Each 25-pounder artillery piece was covered with a wooden and canvas frame shaped like a truck. From above, it looked like a supply convoy. Each tank was enclosed in a structure called a sun shield, supposedly to protect crews from the brutal desert heat. In reality, the sun shield made the tank look like an ordinary supply truck. Hundreds of tanks became hundreds of trucks. German reconnaissance saw exactly what they expected to see: a logistics build-up in the northern sector. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening. Simultaneously, in the southern sector where no attack was planned, a force created a phantom army. 600 fake tanks appeared in assembly areas. These weren't the crude early models. By late 1942, a force had perfected their craft. The new fakes included details German photo interpreters looked for, command variants with distinctive aerials, slight variations in camouflage patterns to suggest different units, even fake tank tracks leading to and from maintenance areas. More importantly, the phantom build-up in the south followed a careful timeline. Fake tanks appeared gradually over 3 weeks, exactly matching the time Montgomery would need to concentrate armour for a real attack. Dummy fuel and ammunition dumps grew larger. Fake water pipelines, made from stacked empty fuel cans painted to look like pipes, extended toward the southern positions. German engineers calculated that the pipeline construction would take 6 weeks, which meant the British attack couldn't come before December. Montgomery attacked on October 23rd. The artillery barrage began at 9:40 p.m., 1,000 guns firing in unison, the largest artillery concentration in British military history. German forward positions were obliterated in minutes. Then the armour moved. Operation Lightfoot, the northern breakthrough, caught Rommel's forces completely out of position. The Africa Corps commander wasn't even in North Africa. He was in Germany on medical leave because German intelligence had assured him no attack was imminent. The defensive sectors Rommel had reinforced based on a force's deception were in the south, miles from the actual fighting. By the time German forces redeploted, Montgomery had achieved his breakthrough. The Second Battle of El Alamein turned the tide in North Africa. Rommel's forces retreated west, never to threaten Egypt again. Churchill would later say, "Before Alamein we never had a victory, after Alamein we never had a defeat." But the victory owed as much to canvas and paint as it did to courage and steel. The fake tanks had done their job. German intelligence analysis captured after the war showed that German photo interpreters never suspected the deception. Their reports from October 1942 confidently stated that the main British strength was in the southern sector and that no major offensive was imminent in the north. They had been completely fooled. The success at El Alamein convinced Allied High Command that deception could work at strategic scale. If fake tanks could fool German intelligence in the desert, what could they do in Europe? In January 1943, the London Controlling Section was established under Colonel John Bevan to coordinate deception across all Allied theatres. Bevan, a stockbroker before the war, had a banker's attention to detail and a gambler's understanding of calculated risk. He assembled a team of deception specialists from intelligence services, entertainment industries, and academia. The challenge for 1944 was unprecedented. The Allies would invade France, probably in late spring or early summer. The Germans knew this. What they didn't know was where. The actual landing site would be Normandy, but the obvious target was Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, only 21 miles from Dover. If the Allies could convince Hitler that Calais was the target, German forces would be positioned in the wrong place when the real invasion came. Operation Fortitude, the deception plan for D-Day, would be the most complex and ambitious deception in military history. It required creating two entirely fictional armies, complete with fake equipment, fake radio traffic, fake administrative orders, and even fake commanders. And it all had to be maintained for months without the Germans detecting a single inconsistency. Fortitude South, the portion of the plan designed to protect the Normandy invasion, centered on the 1st United States Army Group, or FUSAG, supposedly preparing to invade at Calais. FUSAG didn't exist. It was pure fiction, but to German intelligence it had to appear completely real. The deception began with personnel. General George S. Patton, whom the Germans considered the Allies' best commander, was appointed to command FUSAG. Patton's presence was real. He was photographed inspecting fake units, attended fake planning meetings, and gave speeches to phantom divisions. The Germans, who tracked Patton obsessively through signals intelligence and agent reports, concluded that wherever Patton was, the main invasion would follow. In southeastern England, across Kent and Sussex, a vast phantom army materialised. This wasn't the crude work of a force's early days. By 1944, Allied deception had become an industrial operation. The tanks used in Fortitude South were technological marvels of fake engineering. Developed by Colonel John F. Turner, these new designs used inflatable rubber over lightweight frames. Each fake Sherman tank could be inflated in 5 minutes using a bicycle pump. Deflated, 4 men could carry it. Inflated from 100 meters, it was visibly fake. From 2,000 meters, the altitude German reconnaissance aircraft typically operated at over England. It was perfect. Hundreds of these inflatable tanks appeared in Kent. They were arranged in precisely the way real armour would be staged, in organised parks with clearly defined company and battalion areas. Real tanks were driven around them periodically to create track marks. The inflatables even included heat generators, simple devices that warmed the fake tank enough to show up on infrared photography, a technology German reconnaissance was just beginning to employ. Landing craft were equally impressive. In Dover, Folkestone and other channel ports, dozens of fake landing craft sat at anchor. These were plywood shells painted to look like LCTs, landing craft tank. From sea level, they were obviously fake, floating facades with no interior structure. From above, they looked real enough that German reconnaissance counted them in every mission. The commitment to detail was extraordinary. Fake unit insignia appeared on vehicles, laundry hung on lines between tents. Fake anti-aircraft batteries were positioned exactly where real ones would be. Dummy radio masts, complete with actual low-power transmitters, broadcast on frequencies German signals intelligence monitored. Most ingeniously, real soldiers were stationed among the fakes to provide the appearance of activity. These men, sworn to absolute secrecy, would move fake equipment around, drive vehicles through the fake camps to create dust and tracks, and even play football in fields adjacent to the Phantom Army. German reconnaissance photographing these camps saw exactly what they expected: soldiers at leisure between training exercises. The radio deception was perhaps most critical. FUSAG broadcast thousands of radio messages daily, most of them encrypted using codes the British knew had been broken by German intelligence. The messages were carefully crafted to reveal exactly what the Allies wanted Germany to know, while maintaining the appearance of security. Signals about ammunition deliveries, vehicle maintenance, training schedules, and personnel transfers created a completely consistent picture of an army preparing for invasion. The Germans intercepted these signals, decrypted them, and concluded that FUSAG was preparing to attack Calais in mid-July, weeks after the planned Normandy invasion. But deception operations don't work in isolation. They require the target to be predisposed to believe. German military doctrine assumed the Allies would choose the shortest channel crossing. Calais was obvious. It provided the shortest route to the industrial heartland of the Ruhr. It offered better port facilities than Normandy. Attacking at Calais made strategic sense. The fake army in Kent merely confirmed what German planners already believed. The Germans also had agents in Britain, or so they thought. In reality, every German agent in the UK had been captured, killed, or turned by British counterintelligence. The double-cross system, run by the 20 Committee, so called because XX is the Roman numeral for 20 and a double cross, controlled all German intelligence gathering in Britain. These turned agents sent hundreds of reports to their German controllers describing FUSAG preparations. The agent code named Garbo, a Spanish national named Juan Puyol Garcia, who had volunteered to spy for the British, sent extraordinarily detailed reports about FUSAG units, their equipment, their commanders, and their apparent objectives. Garbo's reports were so convincing that the Germans paid him substantial sums and awarded him the Iron Cross, one of the few people to receive decorations from both sides during the war. The Germans never suspected that Garbo was inventing his entire spy network, and that every word he transmitted was approved by British intelligence. As spring 1944 progressed, the Phantom Army in Kent grew more convincing. New fake units appeared. More inflatable tanks were positioned. The dummy landing craft multiplied in channel ports. German reconnaissance flights over England increased in frequency, each one photographing more evidence of the massive build-up across from Calais. In Berchtesgaden, at Hitler's mountain retreat, German intelligence presented their assessment. The main invasion would come at Calais in mid to late July. A smaller diversionary attack might occur elsewhere, perhaps Normandy or Brittany, but the main thrust would be at the Pas de Calais. 15 divisions, including the elite Panzer Lehr Division and elements of the 1st SS Panzer Corps, were positioned to defend the Calais region. These forces represented nearly a third of Germany's mobile reserves in France. They sat in defensive positions 150 miles from the beaches where Allied troops would actually land. On June 5, 1944, the invasion fleet departed British ports heading for Normandy. More than 5,000 ships carrying 150,000 men crossed the Channel in darkness. At dawn on June 6th, they hit the beaches. The Germans were shocked. Normandy? The landings achieved tactical surprise despite months of obvious invasion preparation. German commanders couldn't believe this was the main attack. Fortitude had worked so well that even after Allied troops were fighting their way off the beaches, German intelligence insisted the real invasion was still coming at Calais. The Phantom FUSAG, that enormous fake army in Kent, held 15 German divisions in place for 7 critical weeks. The inflatable tanks and wooden landing craft continued to sit in southeastern England. Radio traffic continued to indicate an army preparing for operations. Agent Garbo sent messages confirming that the Normandy landing was indeed a diversion, and that the main attack at Calais was still coming. Hitler believed it. Even as Allied forces broke out of the Normandy beachhead and began their drive across France, significant German forces remained at Calais waiting for an invasion that would never come. Those 15 divisions, if they had been available to counterattack in Normandy during the critical first weeks, might have driven the Allies back into the sea. Instead, they sat in positions defending against rubber tanks. The success of Fortitude South was so complete that Allied commanders continued the deception after the invasion. Throughout June and July, the fake equipment remained in place, reinforcing German belief that a second invasion was imminent. By the time German intelligence finally accepted that Fusag didn't exist, the war in France was effectively over. Allied forces had broken out of Normandy and were racing toward Germany. The deception had achieved something unprecedented in military history. It had neutralized a third of the enemy's defensive forces without firing a shot. But Operation Fortitude wasn't the only deception operation using fake equipment. Across the Mediterranean, another phantom army was convincing German intelligence that invasions would occur in locations far from actual Allied objectives. Operation Barclay, the deception plan for the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, created two fictional threats. In Egypt, a force assembled a phantom army supposedly preparing to invade Greece. In Algeria, another fake build-up suggested an invasion of Sardinia. Both operations used the same techniques: fake tanks, dummy landing craft, false radio traffic, and carefully planted intelligence. The Operation Barclay fake army in Egypt was particularly elaborate. Over 400 dummy tanks appeared in assembly areas near Alexandria. Fake landing craft filled Egyptian harbours. Real troops conducted highly visible amphibious training exercises. Allied commanders gave speeches about liberating Greece. Radio traffic discussed Greek phrase books and maps of the Aegean. German reconnaissance photographed all of it. The intelligence flowed to Rome and Berlin, where analysts concluded that the Allies planned a major offensive in the eastern Mediterranean. German forces were reinforced in Greece and the Balkans, drawn from the reserves that might otherwise have defended Sicily. When the Allies invaded Sicily on July 9, 1943, they encountered lighter resistance than expected. German commanders had been convinced the real target was elsewhere. Even after the invasion began, Hitler insisted Sicily was a diversion and refused to release reserves from Greece. The fake tanks in Egypt had done it again. Perhaps the most audacious deception operation occurred in Burma, where British forces used fake equipment to convince the Japanese that British strength was far greater than reality. In 1943, British forces in Burma were exhausted, under-equipped, and outnumbered. General William Slim, commanding the 14th Army, had perhaps 200 operational tanks facing a Japanese force that had dominated jungle warfare for years. The solution was deception on a massive scale. British and Indian engineers created fake tank parks throughout Assam and Bengal. These weren't the sophisticated inflatables used in Europe. In the jungle, German-style aerial reconnaissance was less common. The fakes just needed to fool Japanese ground scouts and low-level reconnaissance. The designers created tanks from bamboo frames covered with painted fabric. Each fake cost almost nothing and could be built by local workers with minimal supervision. Hundreds appeared throughout rear areas. The psychological effect was immediate. Japanese scouts reported massive British armoured concentrations. Japanese commanders, whose forces had been repeatedly defeated by British tanks in earlier engagements, became cautious. They reinforced defensive positions and avoided offensive operations. Slim's real tanks, carefully husbanded and used only at critical points, seemed to be everywhere because Japanese intelligence saw them everywhere. The deception contributed to victories at Imphal and Kohima that turned the tide in Burma. But fake tanks were only part of the deception arsenal. British units also used sonic deception, loudspeakers broadcasting the sounds of tank engines and tracked vehicles. These sonic decoys, played at night from concealed positions, convinced Japanese units that they were being flanked by armour. Japanese forces abandoned strong defensive positions because they heard tanks that didn't exist. After the war, when Allied intelligence officers interviewed captured German staff officers, the extent of the deception success became clear. General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations for the German Armed Forces High Command, when shown photographs of the fake equipment, refused to believe it. "This is impossible," he insisted. "Our reconnaissance was thorough. Our intelligence analysis was rigorous. We would have detected fabrications." When informed that the entire fusag had been fictional, that Patton's army had never existed, Jodl was silent for several minutes before finally saying, "Then we never had a chance. If your deception was this complete, our intelligence told us nothing true. We were fighting blind." Analysis of German intelligence reports from 1943 to 1945 revealed that at various times, German commanders believed the Allies had nearly twice as many divisions as actually existed. Much of this phantom strength consisted of fake equipment and fictional units created by deception operations. The fake divisions held real German forces in place, affected strategic decisions, and influenced how resources were allocated. General der Panzertruppen Friedrich von Mellenthin, who served as a senior intelligence officer on both the Eastern and Western fronts, wrote after the war that Allied deception operations achieved effects out of all proportion to the resources invested. "We deployed hundreds of thousands of men against threats that didn't exist," he noted. "We held divisions in reserve against invasions that were never planned. Every fake tank we saw was a real tank we couldn't see. The deception units themselves were tiny. A force at its peak employed fewer than 300 personnel. The units creating fake equipment in Britain numbered perhaps 1,000 men total. Yet these few thousand men, armed with rubber, canvas, paint, and radio transmitters, generated strategic effects equal to entire armies. The cost-effectiveness was extraordinary. A fake Sherman tank cost approximately £100 to produce. A real Sherman cost £25,000. If a fake tank convinced German intelligence to misposition even one real German tank, the investment paid for itself 250 times over. When you consider that the fake armies held 15 divisions in place during D-Day, the return on investment becomes almost incalculable. The technology continued to evolve throughout the war. By 1945, inflatable tanks were nearly perfect deceptions. They included proper tread patterns moulded into the rubber, realistic hatches and tools, even fake wear patterns to suggest combat use, special effects. Crews from Hollywood were employed to create these details. The inflatables were also being fitted with heaters to match thermal signatures and could be equipped with small motors to move tracks, creating realistic movement for low-level reconnaissance. Some fake tanks even included sound systems broadcasting recorded engine noise. The sonic deception technology developed in Burma was refined and deployed in Europe. British units used portable loudspeakers to project the sounds of tanks, trucks, and troops from positions miles away from actual forces. On the night before major operations, these sonic decoys created the impression of large formations moving into position, drawing German reserves away from the real attack axes. The radio deception became even more sophisticated. By 1944, Allied signals units could create completely fictional radio networks that mimicked real military communications down to individual operator sending styles. German signals intelligence could identify individual radio operators by their keying patterns, their fist in signals terminology. Allied deception units recorded real operators and could reproduce their unique patterns, making phantom units appear completely authentic to German listeners. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect was the human dimension. Thousands of Allied personnel were involved in deception operations at various levels. Every one of them kept the secret. Soldiers who spent months guarding inflatable tanks never told their families what they were doing. Officers who planned phantom invasions never hinted at their work. The security was perfect. Not a single Allied service member revealed the deception to German intelligence, either through carelessness or treason. This security itself was a kind of deception operation. German intelligence assumed that operations of this scale couldn't be kept secret, that someone would talk, that some evidence would leak. The fact that nothing leaked actually reinforced German belief that what they were seeing was real. If Fusag was fake, surely someone would have revealed it. Since no one had, it must be real. After the war, the fake equipment was mostly destroyed. Inflatable tanks were burned or buried. Wooden artillery pieces were disassembled. The elaborate constructions that had fooled German intelligence for years disappeared almost overnight. Some items survived. The Imperial War Museum in London has an inflatable Sherman tank on display, one of the few remaining examples of the technology that helped win the war. Deflated, it fits in a small backpack. Inflated, it looks surprisingly convincing even today. Several wooden aircraft, created for airfield deception operations, survive in museums. These fakes, designed to draw German bombing away from real aircraft, were so realistic that museum visitors often don't realize they're looking at plywood and paint. The personnel files of the deception units were classified for decades. Many records were destroyed deliberately to protect the techniques and methods. Some individuals who played crucial roles in deception operations died without anyone knowing what they had done. Jeffrey Barkas, the filmmaker who pioneered visual deception in North Africa, returned to civilian life and worked in British cinema for decades. He wrote a memoir of his war service in 1952, but it was classified until 1978. His obituary in 1980 made no mention of his most significant achievement, creating the techniques that fooled the Afrika Korps. Colonel Dudley Clark, the mastermind behind a force and many of the deception principles used throughout the war, worked in intelligence services after the war ended. His role in deception operations wasn't publicly revealed until the 1970s, nearly 3 decades after the events. Juan Pujol Garcia, the agent Garbo who had provided so much false intelligence to the Germans, disappeared after the war. British intelligence spread rumours that he had died. In reality, he was living quietly in Venezuela. He wasn't publicly identified until 1984 when a British researcher tracked him down. When asked about his work, Garcia said simply that he had wanted to do something against fascism and that deceiving the Germans had seemed like the best way to help. The strategic impact of deception operations has been studied extensively by military historians. Most conclude that operations like Fortitude and Barclay shortened the war in Europe by months, possibly longer. If the D-Day invasion had faced the full weight of German reserves, if those 15 divisions had been in Normandy instead of Calais, the invasion might have failed. At minimum, the breakout would have been delayed significantly. Some historians argue that without the deception operations, D-Day might not have been attempted at all. Allied planners knew they needed surprise to succeed. Without confidence that deception could achieve that surprise, the invasion might have been postponed or cancelled, prolonging the war indefinitely. The fake tanks also influenced post-war military doctrine. Every major military now maintains deception units. The techniques pioneered by A-Force and the London Controlling Section are taught at staff colleges worldwide. Modern military deception uses satellites, electronic warfare, and cyber operations, but the fundamental principles remain the same. Make the enemy see what you want them to see, confirm their expectations, be consistent, and never let them detect the deception. The technology has advanced dramatically. Modern inflatable decoys are made from radar-absorbent materials that mimic the radar signature of real equipment. They include thermal signatures, electromagnetic emissions, and acoustic properties. Some modern fakes are more expensive than the vehicles they imitate were 50 years ago, but the principle remains unchanged. Deception is far cheaper than actual combat. A single fake tank that causes the enemy to misposition real forces achieves effects out of all proportion to its cost. The psychological dimension also persists. Modern military planners understand that perception often matters more than reality. An enemy who believes you have overwhelming force may surrender without fighting. An enemy who believes you will attack from one direction may leave another undefended. The human mind seeks patterns and confirmation of existing beliefs. Show someone what they expect to see, and they'll rarely question it. This principle, exploited so effectively with fake tanks in World War II, remains central to military deception today. In 2003, Lieutenant Colonel James McDonough published a study of World War II deception operations for the United States Army War College. His conclusion was stark. The Allies won World War II as much through deception as through industrial production or military skill. The ability to make the Germans see phantom armies, to hold forces in place against threats that didn't exist, to achieve surprise despite obvious preparations, these capabilities were as strategically significant as radar, code-breaking, or nuclear weapons. Yet, for decades, this decisive contribution was classified, minimized, or forgotten. When veterans of the European campaign hold reunions, those who served in deception units often sit quietly, while others discuss combat actions. They can't share stories about their inflatable tanks or fake radio networks without seeming to diminish the sacrifices of those who fought with real weapons. But some veterans of combat units have begun to understand and acknowledge the contribution. In 1994, at a 50th anniversary commemoration of D-Day, a veteran of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, who who had scaled the cliffs at Pont d'Arc, approached a British veteran who had mentioned serving with the Deception unit. The Ranger had lost half his unit in the first hours of the invasion. He had every reason to focus on combat valour. Instead, he shook the British veteran's hand and said, "You probably saved my life. If those German divisions had been in Normandy instead of Calais, I wouldn't have made it off the beach. Thank you." The recognition was decades overdue but deeply meaningful. The soldiers who guarded inflatable tanks in Kent, who maintained phantom radio networks, who assembled wooden aircraft and canvas artillery pieces, they had fought the war with different weapons, but they had fought just as significantly as anyone who carried a rifle. Fake tanks couldn't capture territory or destroy enemy forces directly, but they could make the enemy put his forces in the wrong place at the wrong time. They could make him see threats that didn't exist and ignore threats that did. They could make him waste resources defending against invasions that would never come. In a total war where every resource mattered, where every division positioned incorrectly was a division that couldn't oppose the real attack, this capability was extraordinarily valuable. The £8 spent on canvas and wood that created a fake tank generated more strategic value than thousands of pounds spent on real equipment if that fake tank held a real German division away from a critical battle. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, arguably Germany's most skilled battlefield commander, spent the spring of 1944 improving defences along the entire French coast. But his resources were limited. He had to prioritise. Based on intelligence indicating the main invasion would come at Calais, he concentrated his best troops, heaviest fortifications and most extensive obstacles in the Pas-de-Calais region. Normandy received less attention. The defences there, while formidable, were incomplete and manned by lower quality troops. This decision, based on intelligence shaped by fake tanks and phantom armies, was strategically catastrophic for Germany. When historians analyse the German defeat in France, they often focus on Allied material superiority, air power, and German strategic mistakes. Less often do they emphasise that German strategy was based on intelligence that the Allies had carefully shaped to be completely wrong. The Germans didn't make bad decisions based on good intelligence. They made reasonable decisions based on intelligence that had been systematically corrupted by deception operations. In his interrogation after the war, General Jodl was asked what single thing might have changed the outcome of the D-Day invasion. His response was immediate: if we had known it was Normandy, if we had positioned our reserves correctly, if we hadn't been deceived. But we never suspected. Your fake army was perfect. Today, the story of the fake tanks is gradually becoming better known. Popular histories, documentaries, and even feature films have explored the deception operations of World War II. But the full scope of the achievement is difficult for most people to grasp. The idea that inflatable tanks and wooden guns could affect the outcome of the largest war in human history seems almost absurd. How could fake equipment be more effective than real weapons? The answer lies in understanding that modern warfare is as much about information and perception as it is about firepower. What an enemy believes affects his decisions, his deployments, his strategic priorities. If you can control what the enemy believes, you can control his actions. The fake tanks controlled German beliefs about Allied intentions, Allied strength, and Allied timing. These false beliefs led to German actions that were operationally sound but strategically disastrous because they were based on fictional intelligence. Every German soldier positioned at Calais waiting for an invasion that never came was a soldier who couldn't fight in Normandy. Every artillery piece, every tank, every ton of ammunition, every litre of fuel sent to defend against Fusag was a resource unavailable elsewhere. Multiply this across 15 divisions for 7 weeks, and the scale of the deception's impact becomes clear. The mathematics are compelling. If Allied deception held 15 German divisions away from Normandy for 7 weeks, that represents roughly 200,000 combat troops, the 500 tanks, the 500 artillery pieces, and millions of tons of supplies that couldn't oppose the invasion. Creating this effect required perhaps 1,000 British and American personnel operating fake equipment that cost less than 100 real tanks. The force multiplication was extraordinary. One fake tank equals hundreds of real ones if the fake tank fools the enemy into misallocating resources. At the going-away dinner for Colonel Dudley Clark in 1947 when he retired from military service, General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, made brief remarks. Most of the speech has been lost to history, but one line was recorded in multiple memoirs. Eisenhower said, "Every tank that didn't exist but convinced a German general to position real forces incorrectly was worth more to the Allied cause than tanks we actually built. You gave us invisible divisions that held the enemy in place better than real divisions could have. The Germans still don't know how completely they were deceived." The statement proved prophetic. For decades after the war, German veterans insisted that Allied numerical superiority was the decisive factor in their defeat. They never fully grasped that much of that apparent superiority was phantom, that divisions they feared didn't exist, that invasion threats they defended against were fictions. Some German officers went to their graves believing that Fusag had been real, that Patton's Phantom Army had eventually invaded somewhere, that their intelligence had been essentially accurate. They never imagined that the canvas and rubber silhouettes they had seen in reconnaissance photos were props in history's greatest theatrical production, a production where the audience didn't know they were being deceived, where the stage was an entire continent, and where the stakes were the freedom of Europe. In May 1945, when German forces surrendered, when the war in Europe ended, the fake tank farms in England were quietly dismantled. Soldiers who had spent months inflating rubber Shermans and repositioning wooden artillery were reassigned to occupation duties or sent home. The inflatable tanks were deflated one last time, folded into transport cases, and sent to warehouses where most would eventually be destroyed. A few officers suggested keeping the equipment for future use, but the proposal was rejected. The technology was too valuable to risk falling into Soviet hands as Cold War tensions began emerging. The men of the deception units packed up their equipment with mixed feelings. They had spent the war engaged in what seemed like theatrical absurdity, guarding fake tanks while their friends fought with real weapons. Many felt they had missed the real war, that their contribution had been marginal. They didn't yet understand that their rubber tanks had been as decisive as any weapon carried into combat. In the years immediately after the war, the deception operations remained highly classified. Personnel were forbidden from discussing their wartime duties even with family members. Security classifications meant that official histories of the war made no mention of the fake armies. The story of D-Day was told as a tale of courage, planning, and industrial might. The inflatable tanks that had held 15 divisions away from the beaches went unmentioned. This silence created a distorted historical record. Historians analysing the Normandy invasion struggled to explain why German responses had been so ineffective. Why had Rommel positioned so many forces at Calais? Why had German reserves been committed so slowly? Why had Hitler refused to believe Normandy was the main invasion? The answers existed in classified files that wouldn't be opened for decades. The first hints of the deception operations began emerging in the 1950s, when some participants published carefully sanitized memoirs. Jasper Maskelyne, the magician who had served with a force in North Africa, published a book in 1949 titled Magic Top Secret. It contained heavily fictionalized accounts of deception operations, exaggerating his personal role while omitting technical details. British censors allowed publication because the inaccuracies actually helped maintain security. Anyone trying to understand deception techniques from Maskelyne's book would be thoroughly misled. More accurate accounts began appearing in the 1970s as documents were gradually declassified. The official history of British deception operations, written by Sir Michael Howard, was published in 1990 and finally revealed the full scope of operations like Fortitude and Barclay. The book was densely detailed, carefully researched, and read primarily by military historians. It won awards but received relatively little public attention. Meanwhile, the veterans were aging. Men who had served with deception units were dying, taking their stories with them. Many had never told their families exactly what they did during the war. Their obituaries listed service with signals, units, or engineering corps, generic descriptions that concealed their actual roles. The specific knowledge of how to build convincing fake tanks, how to position them for maximum deceptive effect, how to coordinate radio traffic with visual deception, this expertise was being lost. In the 1990s, several veterans organizations began trying to document the deception operations before all participants were gone. They conducted oral history interviews, gathered photographs that had been kept in personal collections, and assembled technical documents that had somehow escaped destruction. The Imperial War Museum in London established a special collection dedicated to deception operations. Researchers were surprised by what they found. the sophistication of the deception techniques exceeded what anyone had suspected. The inflatable tanks weren't crude balloons, they were precisely engineered devices with carefully calculated thermal properties, exact weight distributions to create proper track marks, and internal structures designed to maintain shape in high winds. The wooden aircraft weren't simple plywood cutouts. They included movable control surfaces, painted panel lines accurate to specific aircraft variants, and even fake oil stains positioned where real engines would leak. The radio deception was equally sophisticated. Researchers discovered that deception units had created entire fictional military bureaucracies, complete with fake personnel files, equipment inventories, and administrative correspondence. If German intelligence had somehow captured documents from FUSAG, they would have found completely consistent records spanning months of fictional operations. Every fake unit had a fake commanding officer with a fictional but consistent service record. Every fake tank had a serial number that fit proper sequences. Every fake operation was supported by fake logistics documentation. The level of detail was obsessive because it had to be. German intelligence was professional and thorough. Any inconsistency, any detail that didn't match expectations would have raised suspicions. The deception had to be perfect, or it would fail completely. There was no middle ground between the Germans believing completely or suspecting everything. This requirement for perfection created enormous pressure on deception units. A single mistake, one fake tank positioned where real doctrine wouldn't place it, one radio message that didn't match proper military format, one photograph showing equipment inconsistent with supposed unit organization, any of these could have unraveled the entire operation. The stress affected personnel. Several officers involved in planning Fortitude suffered nervous breakdowns in the months before D-Day. The weight of knowing that thousands of lives depended on their fake army being convincing was crushing. If the deception failed, if German reserves were positioned correctly in Normandy, the invasion could be defeated and the war prolonged indefinitely. The responsibility was enormous. One officer, whose name remains classified even today, had to be hospitalized in April 1944 after becoming convinced that German intelligence had detected the deception and that the entire invasion was doomed. He recovered but never returned to deception work. His replacement, stepping into the role with just weeks before the invasion, had to rapidly master technical details that others had spent months learning. Despite these pressures, the deception held. Not a single significant error was made. The fake army remained convincing until long after it had served its purpose. German intelligence never suspected. This operational security success may have been as impressive as the deception itself. After the war, the Soviet Union attempted to determine how Allied deception had worked. Soviet intelligence had obtained some information about the operations through their spy networks in Britain, but the technical details remained mysterious. In the late 1940s, the Soviets created their own deception units, attempting to replicate the inflatable tank technology. Early Soviet fakes were crude and unconvincing, suggesting they had been working from descriptions rather than actual examples. By the 1960s, Soviet deception technology had improved significantly. During the Cold War, both NATO and Warsaw Pact forces maintained extensive stocks of inflatable equipment. Modern militaries had learned the lesson of World War II. Fake equipment, properly employed, could be as valuable as real weapons. The United States military, which had relied heavily on British deception expertise during World War II, developed its own capabilities in subsequent decades. American inflatable decoys became standard equipment for mechanized units. During the Cold War in Europe, NATO forces practiced deploying fake tank battalions to confuse Soviet reconnaissance. The techniques pioneered in Kent in 1944 had become standard military doctrine. In the 1991 Gulf War, coalition forces used inflatable decoys extensively. Fake tanks, fake artillery, and fake command posts were positioned to mislead Iraqi intelligence about coalition force dispositions. Iraqi forces bombarded these fake positions with artillery and even conducted airstrikes against inflatable equipment. Thousands of rounds of ammunition were wasted against targets that didn't exist. Ammunition that couldn't then be used against real coalition units. Modern deception technology has advanced far beyond the canvas and rubber of World War II. Contemporary inflatable decoys include radar reflectors that mimic the electronic signature of real equipment. Thermal blankets generate heat signatures matching actual vehicles. Some advanced decoys include motors and sound systems, creating the noise of operating equipment. The most sophisticated modern fakes cost tens of thousands of dollars each, but they still represent a tiny fraction of the cost of real military hardware. The fundamental principle remains unchanged. It's cheaper to make the enemy waste resources attacking fake targets than to defend against attacks on real ones. Every bomb dropped on an inflatable tank is a bomb that can't be used against real forces. Every reconnaissance asset dedicated to tracking fake units is an asset not watching actual movements. Every intelligence analyst studying fake radio traffic is an analyst not detecting real operations. But modern military forces also understand something that World War II deception units learn through experience. Deception only works if it's consistent, comprehensive, and sustained. A few fake tanks scattered randomly won't deceive professional intelligence analysts, but hundreds of fakes, properly positioned, with supporting radio traffic, consistent logistics signatures, and behavior matching real unit doctrine that can fool even sophisticated intelligence systems. The same principles apply beyond military operations. Modern cyber warfare uses deception extensively. Fake computer systems, honeypots in security terminology, are designed to attract attackers and waste their resources. Fake data is planted in systems that adversaries are likely to penetrate, leading them to wrong conclusions. False flag operations make attacks appear to come from someone else. The technology is digital rather than canvas and rubber, but the underlying concepts are identical to those used at El Alamein and Normandy. Corporate intelligence and counterintelligence also employ deceptive techniques. Companies plant false information about product launches, merger plans, or strategic initiatives to mislead competitors. The fake information creates the same effects as fake tanks, causing competitors to waste resources preparing for events that won't happen, or to miss actual developments while focused on fictional ones. In 2014, a conference on military deception held at the Royal United Services Institute in London brought together historians, veterans, and current military officers. Several elderly men attended who had served with deception units in World War II. They were in their 90s, among the last survivors of the operations. One of them, a former sergeant who had helped assemble inflatable tanks in Kent before D-Day, was asked about his feelings regarding his wartime service. His response captured something essential about the nature of deception operations. He said, "For years I felt I hadn't really served. My mates were in combat while I was inflating rubber tanks. I felt like a fraud. Then in the 1980s I read a history of D-Day that mentioned the deception operations. It said that holding those German divisions at Calais may have saved thousands of Allied lives. That's when I understood. My fake tanks were real after all, not in the physical sense, but in what they accomplished. They were as real as any weapon because they changed what happened. I helped win the war with a bicycle pump and some painted rubber. That's something." The recognition came late for most deception unit veterans. Many died before their contribution was publicly acknowledged, but those who lived long enough to see the declassification of the operations found that their wartime service was finally understood and appreciated. They had indeed fought the war, just with different weapons. In 2019, the few remaining veterans of the deception operations were invited to Normandy for the 75th anniversary of D-Day. There were only a handful left, all over 95 years old. They stood on the beaches where their fake tanks had, in a strange way, helped secure victory. The thousands of young men who had died on those beaches 75 years earlier never knew that rubber and canvas had helped get them ashore, but the elderly men standing on the beach knew. They understood that their inflatable tanks had held German divisions away long enough for those young men to gain a foothold and begin the liberation of Europe. One of these veterans, interviewed by a documentary crew, was asked if he had any regrets about his service. He paused for a long time before responding, "I regret that we couldn't save more of them. If our deception had been even better, if we'd held even more German divisions away from Normandy, maybe fewer boys would have died on these beaches. But we did what we could with what we had. We fought with illusions instead of guns, and it worked. That has to be enough." The last known veteran of the D-Day deception operations died in 2021 at age 98. His obituary mentioned his service with a signals unit in England during the war, but didn't specify his actual role. His family, clearing his belongings, found a carefully preserved photograph showing him standing next to what appeared to be a Sherman tank. Only when they contacted military historians did they learn that the tank in the photograph was inflatable, and that their father had spent D-Day guarding rubber equipment that helped change history. The photograph now sits in the Imperial War Museum collection, one of the few surviving images showing deception personnel with their equipment. The young man in the photograph, barely 20 years old, stands proudly next to his fake tank. He couldn't have known then that his rubber Sherman would contribute to victory more directly than many real tanks did. He was just doing his duty, following orders, maintaining security about operations he probably didn't fully understand. But history understands now. The story of the fake tanks is finally being told, more than 75 years after they served their purpose. Modern historians recognize that operations like Fortitude were as significant as any battle, that the deception units armed with canvas and paint achieved strategic effects equal to entire armies. The lessons extend beyond World War II. Every conflict since has included deception operations, though most remain classified. Military forces understand that perception management, making the enemy see what you want him to see, is as important as actual combat capability. The fake tank farms of 1944 demonstrated a principle that remains central to military doctrine. The enemy's beliefs about your forces can be more important than your actual capabilities. In the archives of the Imperial War Museum, in boxes marked with classifications that have only recently been lifted, sit thousands of pages of documents detailing deception operations. Technical drawings show exact specifications for inflatable tanks. Radiologs document thousands of fake messages. Reconnaissance photographs show fake equipment from German perspectives. After-action reports analyse what worked and what didn't. Together, these documents tell the story of how Britain and America fought the war not just with steel and explosives, but with imagination and deception. Perhaps the most remarkable document in the collection is a German intelligence assessment dated June 30th, 1944, 3 weeks after D-Day. The report analyses Allied force dispositions and concludes that the main invasion is still to come at Calais. WWII, the Phantom Army, is reported to be preparing for imminent operations. The German assessment recommends maintaining strong defensive positions in the Pas-de-Calais area. By the time this report was written, Allied forces were already breaking out of Normandy. The fake tanks had done their job so well that German intelligence still hadn't realised they'd been deceived. That report, typed on a German military typewriter, stamped with official seals, filed according to proper bureaucratic procedures, represents the ultimate success of deception operations. The enemy believed completely. They never suspected. They made decisions based on fictional intelligence that led directly to their defeat. All because some British soldiers had inflated rubber tanks and transmitted fake radio messages. When Geoffrey Barkas, the filmmaker who pioneered visual deception in North Africa, was asked in 1978 about the most satisfying moment of his military career, he didn't mention any specific operation or particular success. Instead, he recalled a conversation after the war with a captured German intelligence officer. The German, reviewing photographs of fake equipment, had said, "You made us see what we expected to see. That's the most sophisticated form of deception. Not forcing us to believe lies, but confirming the lies we already believed." Barkas had realised then that deception worked because it played to human psychology, to the tendency to see what we expect and believe what confirms our assumptions. This psychological dimension explains why the fake tanks were so effective. German intelligence expected the invasion at Calais because it made strategic sense. The fake army in Kent confirmed what they already believed. They weren't tricked into believing something implausible. They were given evidence supporting a conclusion they had already reached independently. The deception worked with German logic, not against it. Modern deception operations use the same principle. The best deception doesn't force the enemy to believe something impossible. It confirms what they already suspect. It provides evidence supporting conclusions they want to reach. It makes them feel smart for detecting patterns that were deliberately planted. This approach is far more effective than trying to convince someone of something that contradicts their existing beliefs. The fake tanks of World War II represent the perfection of this approach. They didn't convince Germans that the impossible was true. They convinced Germans that the probable was certain, that Calais was not just a possible invasion site, but the definite target. That WWII was not just a potential threat, but an imminent one, that the evidence before them was confirmation, not deception. In the final analysis, the inflatable tanks and wooden guns of World War II achieved something extraordinary. They created fictional forces that held real armies in place. They generated strategic effects without physical combat. They turned paint and canvas into weapons as decisive as any bomb or bullet, and they did so through understanding that in warfare, perception is often more powerful than reality. The German soldiers who sat in defensive positions at Calais through June and July of 1944 were guarding against a threat that existed only in British imagination. The tanks they feared were rubber. The artillery they expected was wood. The army they prepared to face was a phantom. Yet their very real divisions were held uselessly in place by these fictional threats, while actual combat occurred 150 miles away. This is the paradox at the heart of military deception. Something that doesn't exist can have effects as real as anything physical. A fake tank that convinces an enemy general to position forces incorrectly achieves results that real tanks might not. The deception becomes reality through its effects on enemy decision-making. When the last inflatable tank was deflated and packed away in 1945, when the wooden artillery pieces were disassembled and burned, when the fake landing craft were towed away and scrapped, the physical evidence of the deception disappeared. But the effects remained. German divisions had been positioned incorrectly. Resources had been allocated based on false intelligence. Strategic decisions had been made that couldn't be reversed. The fake equipment was gone, but what it had accomplished persisted. History remembers the real tanks, the actual armies, the physical weapons of World War II. Museums display genuine equipment, carefully preserved and restored. Veterans recall operating real machines in actual combat. Historians analyze production figures for authentic military hardware. All of this is appropriate and necessary, but somewhere in that history should be recognition that rubber tanks held divisions in place as effectively as steel ones, that wooden artillery pieces affected German strategy as directly as functional weapons, and that canvas and paint, properly employed with imagination and attention to detail, changed the course of the war as decisively as any technology. The soldiers who inflated those tanks, who positioned those wooden guns, who transmitted those fake radio messages, they fought with different weapons, but they fought just as effectively. Their battlefield was perception. Their ammunition was deception. Their victories were measured in German divisions positioned incorrectly and resources allocated wastefully. And when Klaus Hahn photographed those fake tanks over Kent in May 1944, when he transmitted his reconnaissance images to intelligence headquarters, when German analysts studied his photographs and confirmed what they already believed, the deception achieved its purpose. The fake became functionally real through its effects on enemy perception and decision-making. That's the final lesson of the fake tanks. Reality is complicated. What exists physically is only part of what matters. What the enemy believes you have can be more important than what you actually possess. And sometimes, the most effective weapons are the ones that exist only in the enemy's imagination, placed there deliberately by those who understand that winning wars requires deceiving the enemy about when, where, and how you'll fight. The fake tanks fooled entire German armies. They held divisions in place. They affected strategic decisions. They saved thousands of Allied lives. They helped win the war. And they did all of this despite being nothing more than rubber and air, canvas and wood, paint and imagination. That may be the most remarkable military achievement of all.